You might have heard that sauerkraut is very good for your gut, or drinking kombucha will do wonders for your health. So what exactly is behind these superfoods and why are they so good for us? To tell us more about fermented foods and how to use them in the kitchen is Charlotte Jean, a clinical nutritional therapist. Charlotte, welcome back. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Mark.
Now, fermented foods, there are a variety of them, but let's just get to the fundamentals of why is a fermented food healthy?
So if we look at fermentation, it was actually the first way that human beings found to preserve the longevity of food, and it happened by mistake.
Okay.
So there's a story of a whole bunch of people traveling through a desert in ancient northern Africa, and they were obviously trying to keep their camel milk fresh.
Right.
But they were in the desert for an extended period of time. When they opened the camel milk, it was sour.
Okay.
And they had nothing else, so they drank it and they didn't die. And then they figured out that that was actually a way to create something that could last longer and still be nutritionally viable.
Right.
So it was only later in the 1900s, along with Louis Pasteur, who we all remember,
Yes,
you know, in terms of penicillin and rabies, who then started to figure out that there was a medicinal benefit with fermented foods because they occur in an anaerobic environment where the bad bacteria is killed off by the present starches and sugars in those foods. It's a naturally occurring process, so you don't even need to do anything. You just need to let those foods sit in a kind of sterile environment that's air controlled for a certain amount of time.
Yes.
And then when you eat them, you've taken them from being, you know, marginally good for you as a functional food or just as a source of calories to now containing a huge amount of probiotics, prebiotics, phytochemicals, antioxidants. And so that food that could have been good for you is now much, much better for you as a source of a medicinal food.
Okay. Now, when you talk about fermentation, obviously beer and wine and alcohol is a fermentation process. So, but that can become unhealthy. So what is it that is the balancing factor between fermented foods, and also maybe just to give a bit of a sense of, can you go too far with fermented foods in terms of turning them into some sort of an alcoholic something?
Yes. Well, Michael, the funny thing about food is that it subscribes to the same principles as anything. So I was fascinated when I studied fermented foods to discover that chocolate is actually a fermented food.
Okay.
Had no idea. And some forms of coffee, because you don't associate that with the taste. We normally think that it's sour.
Yes, absolutely.
And so when we look at the use of fermented foods, it has a lot to do with the content of sugar and ethanol.
Okay.
So a highly beneficial fermented food has got a low alcohol content. In fact, we would want the alcohol to have been released during the process of fermentation. So in the last kind of 24 to 48 hours, the little lid or whatever the receptacle is that's been used for the fermentation is lifted, and so that alcohol escapes normally, you know, through just the air. And then the sugar content also needs to be low.
Okay.
So that's why we would say, you know, a wine that has a lower alcohol content, a lower sugar content, would be healthier for you than a wine that has
higher alcohol,
the higher and the higher sugar. So
there's no excuse saying that I've got my wine, I'm fine, I'm doing my fermented foods. Really, it's not the same thing.
No. We need to also look at what the food is doing in terms of its medicinal benefits. So I've always recommended to my clients that you treat a fermented food as medicine. You're never going to take your medicine and make it your staple for the day.
Yes, right.
So you're going to build up your ability in terms of your gut to eat it. So it's going to be a small portion, you know, that you're adding with the rest of your food. And you're also going to test it, because if you struggle with foods, for example, like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, all part of the brassica family, they contain high levels of phytic acid. You're also going to struggle with them as fermented foods. Not as much, because they're now more bioavailable and more digestible. But you're still going to get that feeling of, oh, I'm a bit bloated, shouldn't have eaten so much. So you have to treat it with caution. What
are some of the most common fermented foods that people could be quite comfortable to give it a try to actually make it, or are available in stores?
I think it's important, first of all, to know if you do have a rich culinary heritage, how can you introduce that within the way that you eat? And then secondly, to look at the environment that you're living in. So if you're living in a very cold environment, here's a funny example. So the Free State in South Africa can often get freezing.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of my clients took kefir. Kefir is a beautiful fermented dairy product that is good for most people. But they took a starter kit of kefir back with them. And that poor kefir didn't do anything.
Okay.
It died a horrible death, and there were even bits of mold that were forming, because it was too cold. So it's to understand your own external environment in terms of the fermented food. So kefir is a good one if you're in a warm, slightly humid, not too dry environment. And that's a popular fermented food. We've also spoken about kombucha.
Yes.
Which I find based on a person's tolerance in their tummy. And I've often said to them, as my clients, an easy way to tell if you need a kefir or a kombucha is that a kefir is more of a fermented dairy. And so if you don't really struggle too much with dairy, you're going to do well with kefir.
Okay.
But if you do struggle with dairy and you kind of get that mucus discharge, not a good idea to have too much of it. Kind of just add it as a small little tablespoon to your salad dressing.
Okay, yeah.
Don't
so you can still
have
get it in, but you don't have to have mouth.
Yeah, not have like a cup of it. Whereas you would probably do better then with a kombucha.
Okay, so cool. We've got kombucha, we've got kefir. Talk about, you spoke about the cabbages and the brassica family.
Yes.
What do we do there?
So that's a nice sauerkraut kind of pickle root that you can walk. And there's some beautiful recipes that you can find that are freely accessible. But generally, you'd be cutting up certain vegetables like your cabbage, your carrot, celery, and you'd be using salt and a vinegar as a starter base. And just covering, so you'd make sure that the vegetables are covered completely. There's about half kind of a finger space between that and the top of the little mason jar that you're putting it in, and you're putting in a cupboard where it's warm and it's away from light. And you generally have to wait about 10 days for fermentation to actually occur correctly. It is recommended that you follow the instructions carefully because you can get sick. You can. And then there's other forms of making your own, like a vinegar. Where you can use an apple base, and it also goes through the process of fermentation. I would say it's looking at something that's going to be convenient, that you can keep in your kitchen, that you can maintain. I
think one of the joys of fermented foods, and I have to give a massive confession here, because through lockdown, our house became a big fermentation station. We've got kombucha and kimchi and sauerkrauts and things, because it's fun to make, and also sourdough breads. But the best part about it is every time somebody pops in to visit, like here's a SCOBY for the kombucha, or here's some starter for the bread. So you can also share it out, which is such a fun process. You
can.
Just a quick question. Pickles in general, like if you go into the store and buy pickled onions or gherkins or something like that, is there much benefit in that? Have they been fermented, or is that just more like a process, preservation process?
Yeah, Michael, it broke my heart when I realized that my favorite pickled beetroot and gherkins have absolutely zero benefits. In fact, probably less than zero, because all commercial pickled products are artificially fermented. So that whole process of fermentation has to occur naturally for the health benefits to be a reality.
What are the risks in terms of herbicides, pesticides, things like that? What should you be doing just to kind of make sure you're not getting all of that stuff as well?
Well, in an ideal world, you need to try and source as clean and organic as you can. Obviously, our world is not ideal, so you'd want to soak your vegetables in something like apple cider vinegar, salt, or colloidal silver, which also kills all your microbes before you would use them. And then, although it's not great, you'd still want to have the skins because they contain so many of the benefits of the vegetables. I would just say, if you're not sure about the origin, just peel.
Yeah. So you'll still get that fermentation benefit even if you're peeling all that out?
Yes, even if you've peeled. And then the idea there with fermented vegetables is that the thicker and the more solid they are, the better they respond to fermentation. Thinner vegetables will still ferment, but they'll break They'll actually be fragmented and shattered actually in the process. So it'll be hard. I mean, when I was in Korea, I ate everything that was fermented. I think they fermented everything. So it was fermented spinach.
Oh wow, okay. So pretty much literally anything.
Anything got, and it was just, it wasn't very pleasant in terms of my palate because it had
the texture thing.
It wasn't. It was slimy. So you want to have thick vegetables that you can chop.
Right.
Into certain sizes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Charlotte, I think that's a really lovely discussion. I think I'm completely on board the fermented food wagon because it really is. There's lots of flavor and taste and texture and things like that. So thanks for giving a bit more insight and shedding some more light on them.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.